Entonces, primero voy a dar algunas indicaciones para quienes nos están siguiendo por Zoom, para tener acceso a la traducción en español. Una vez que empecemos a hablar en inglés, tienen que apretar el botoncito abajo de la pantalla donde aparece un globo terráqueo y ahí elegir el idioma español o inglés, según corresponda. Voy a presentar brevemente las invitadas para que pronto puedan empezar ellas a presentar su trabajo. Entonces, Emily Dawson es profesora asociada del University College en Londres. Antes de dedicarse a la investigación y la docencia universitaria, ella trabajó varios años como profesional de la comunicación y la mediación científica. El 2019 publicó este libro que se ve en pantalla, Equidad, exclusión y aprendizaje de la ciencia en lo cotidiano. Experiencias desde grupos minorizados, que es basado en su tesis doctoral. El año 2020, Emily fue galardonada con el premio Philip Leverhulme por su investigación en sociología de la ciencia y la educación y su enfoque en cómo las desigualdades estructurales en la sociedad afectan las experiencias con la ciencia de las personas de sectores populares en contextos no escolares. Clemencé Perronnet es socióloga académica del Departamento de Ciencias de la Educación de la Universidad Católica del Oeste en Francia. Hace un mes atrás salió publicado este libro, también basado en su tesis doctoral, cuyo título no es muy simple de traducir. Tiene que ver con restablecer la igualdad de oportunidades en el proceso de enseñanza-aprendizaje y la divulgación de las ciencias a públicos escolares. Ambos libros tratan del desigual acceso a la ciencia en Francia e Inglaterra, e incluso a las dinámicas sociales de exclusión de la ciencia, que afectan a las mujeres, a los grupos socioeconómicos más vulnerables y a los grupos racializados por sus características étnicas distintas a las del grupo blanco europeo culturalmente dominante. Ambos libros proponen, además de un diagnóstico y un estudio de las lógicas sociales de exclusión, varias propuestas para avanzar hacia una mayor inclusión en nuestras prácticas cotidianas, seamos académicas y académicos, profesores y profesionales de la educación, divulgadores científicas y científicos, estudiantes, padres y madres, etc. Y desde el Anillo Matemáticas y Género, creemos que estas reflexiones tienen mucha relevancia en el contexto chileno. Por esto invitamos a estas dos investigadoras de lujo y les agradecemos estar con nosotras y nosotros hoy. Vamos a abordar estas dos grandes preguntas en este conversatorio. Ahora voy a pasar al inglés para dirigirme a ellas. So, Clemence and Emily, thank you very, very much for being here with us today. As agreed before, my proposal is that both of you articulate her speech, her talk, around these two big questions. The first one is, why is it important that science should be as diverse as possible? And the second one is, how does exclusion operate in childhood and adulthood, at school, and also in other science learning spaces such as museums? And then, Clemence, would you like to start? We will. I will just remind that we will have about 30 minutes, 1 hour in total of talk, 30 minutes each, and then we will have questions from the audience. So, Clemence, please.
Thank you, Jeanne, and thank you for having us today. I will start with one of the questions that we thought we could both Emily and I talk about tonight, and that is the question of the relationship between access to science and social justice. So I would say a few words about that, and then from that, we can talk about why it is so important that science is as diverse as possible. But first, what I wanted to say today is that if we want to better understand the relationship between access to science and social justice, we need first to consider the way in which science participates in power relations in our societies. So in order to do that, we have to force ourselves to move away from an idea that is widely shared, and it's that science is neutral, that it is socially neutral. That means that we tend to think that anyone curious enough, no matter his or her background or social characteristics, can easily access science if he or she wants to, that people can easily contribute to and succeed in science, that is, be recognized or rewarded for their contributions. So what's interesting to me is that nowadays, thanks to decades of sociological research on culture and social classes, we tend to accept that cultural products linked to the arts or the humanities tend to favor the wealthy social classes. And we know that they are associated with a dominant high culture that is discriminative against those from more disadvantaged or modest backgrounds. So we have this mindset. We know about cultural inequalities in our societies, and yet we perceive science, in contrast, as a field that favors those who we often say come from below. So we believe that in order to succeed in science, we rely more on hard work and personal merit, more than on a familial cultural heritage. And that is something that is very important and that is very present in our school systems, where science is presented and is framed as a weapon of the weak. For instance, it's very clear and very visible when we look at the French educational history, because in France, when we established Republican state school at the end of the 19th century, it was an important moment because it's the point where schools were meant not only to educate the aristocracy and the rich, but all the people. So when we tried to create a school to welcome and to educate all the people, we put science, maths, and physics at the center of their curriculum. And there was a good reason for it. It was that subjects like Latin and grammar have been the most important subjects for the aristocracy and for the elites. So it was thought at that moment that science would be a better subject to give to all students to make them equal in the new founded school. Educators really believed it was a good way to give equal opportunities to all thanks to science. But, and I think that's here that things get complicated, but also pretty interesting. Since the beginning, intentions were quite ambivalent because science as a school subject was also meant to discipline the poor and later on the colonized populations. So science was given to them also in order to make them fall in line with a certain idea of progress that did not favor their own emancipation, but rather served the interest of the ruling class. So it's no coincidence that today the scientific courses of study are still those who provide the best careers, the best salaries, and the best social positions. So I wanted to start with this to really point out that access to and participation in science is very much a question of who has the power in a given society. And I wanted to start with this contradiction. On one hand, science is supposed to be neutral and accessible to all, and also very desirable because it allegedly brings progress. But on the other hand, only those we label as the best of us seem to actually have a chance to access it and to succeed in scientific studies and careers. So it leaves us pondering at the numbers. Why so few women in science? Why so few people from the working classes or from minorities? What's keeping them away from science? And in order to make sense of this contradiction, we tend to fall back on two main sets of explanations, two main ways of explaining it. The first one is to believe that interest and ability in science could be innate. It could be given at birth. Maybe some of us just have it, maybe some of us don't. I think most of us experienced this feeling in front of a math problem. I just don't have what it takes. I'll never be able to get that. I'm just not made that way. So we tend to think that maybe it's something in our brains, maybe it's something in our genes, we don't really know, but maybe boys have it, maybe girls just don't have it. We fall back on this set of explanations. The other type of explanations we fall back on is that we express that some people maybe just don't understand how good and how useful science could be. And that is why they just don't perceive it, right? And that's why they don't go and try to participate and to be more interested in it. And I will leave, Emily will explain about this better in a few seconds. What I want to say before I leave the floor to her is that our research, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but our research shows that both these explanations are actually quite wrong. So thinking that there is an innate taste or innate capabilities in science, but also the explanation that just some of us just don't get it. Both these explanations are quite wrong, and they prevent us from actually understanding the ways that people relate to science. Because if we keep looking at the wrong place, and if we keep looking at those who don't participate, that is women, that is people from the working classes, and that is people from minorities, if we keep trying to find the fault in them or trying to show their responsibility in this situation, we won't get anywhere, and we are not getting anywhere. Participation in science is a problem that is clearly pointed out for decades now, and we are not getting anywhere close to solving it. So rather than talking about a misunderstanding on the part of the public or a lack of self-confidence, or even sometimes we hear about a self-censorship towards science, people who just put barriers inside themselves. We need to stop talking about all this and consider the way science as institution and practices and cultural products actually actively excludes some social groups, and mainly women, the working classes, and minorities. And I will let Emily explain this further.
Thank you very much, Clémence. Emily, your turn.
Oh, gracias, Clémence. Gracias, Jeanne. Hola a todos. Me llamo Emily, and my Spanish is not good enough to carry on in Spanish. So I will go to English, and I will say thank you to Jeanne for inviting me, and thank you to our amazing interpreters for allowing me to speak with you all today. So the question Jeanne posed was, why is it important then that we should think about inclusion in science? Why should diverse science be important to our societies? And I have a short answer and a long answer for you today. The short answer to these questions, from my perspective, is that science, whether we understand that as content knowledge, as practices, as sets of communities, or as the applications of that science, plays really important roles in our societies. Roles which, as I'm sure we have all experienced, the pandemic has really pulled into focus. What that means is it is crucial for those opportunities to engage with science, to learn, to question it, to laugh at it, to mock it, to contribute to it, and to change it. Those opportunities need to be inclusive. And given their importance and the power, as Clemencé has suggested, involved, these opportunities have to be as meaningfully inclusive, as respectful, and as accessible as possible to everyone. So that was the short answer. Let me give you the long answer. The long answer is that, of course, as I'm sure you all know, there are a lot of nuances to think about. Consider, for instance, what I just said, that given their importance, science opportunities have to be meaningfully inclusive and accessible for everyone. Now, I have seen that kind of argument used in ways that I do not think are inclusive or socially just. So, for instance, science in this kind of argument can become something that is framed as good for you, whether you want it or not, whether it is good for you or not. So there are a lot of sometimes conflicting arguments made for trying to build an inclusive culture of participation around science. And from a social justice perspective, I think it's important that we think about these really carefully. It is not, for instance, I would argue, appropriate to frame inclusion in science as a colonial empire building exercise where recruitment to science above all else is the driving logic. So the argument I made in the book that Jeanne showed earlier is that exclusion and inclusion are usually framed in how science operates with two fundamental mistakes. So the first, as Clemencé has said, assuming a double deficit on the part of people who are not involved in science. And the second, making this assumption that inclusion needs to be a kind of crusade. So I'll go through each of these now. So this first misunderstanding, the double deficit. So not taking part in science-related activities, whether that's science education in schools, science communication in the mass media or social media, or other forms of science cultural engagement. This not taking part is framed as a choice that people make. And this choice is understood very judgmentally as a mistake. This mistake is understood as the result of people first, echoing Clemencé, having the wrong attitudes. And in our field, that is framed as the mistake of disliking science or maths or engineering or medicine in its various iterations and applications. This dislike then, or sense of alienation, is often framed as the result of ignorance, of not knowing any better. In our field, we often talk about this as a deficit model. And despite the idea of a deficit model being critiqued for a very long time, it persists with remarkable tenacity. And I think one reason for this is because it does a lot of work for maintaining the status quo and structural inequalities around science. This mistake of not getting involved in science is also understood as the result of people having just the wrong behaviors. They don't do the right things, and what that typically means is that the people who are excluded do not take part in dominant cultural activities. And again, if only they knew how amazing a visit to a planetarium or a science museum could be, then surely they would change their minds. The key take home here for me is that these two deficits double up. And crucially, as Clemencé has said, they position the responsibility for participation onto, or the fault, onto excluded groups and people. So this is a very deft sleight of hand. This is a very slippery move. It removes responsibility from institutions, from practitioners, from researchers, and from policymakers. And it places that responsibility firmly on the shoulders of the people who are most oppressed by structural inequalities, and in many ways, the least able to change anything about this system. So then the second misunderstanding is the crusade. And this idea emerges when we look at how inclusion into science is understood. The underlying idea is that inclusion must be a kind of crusade. This concept has its roots in the idea of a double deficit because it is premised on the belief that first, dominant forms of engaging with science are the ones that matter most, and everything else is invisible or irrelevant. And two, that dominant forms of scientific knowledge matter most. And in this set of assumptions, science is almost seen as a vitamin, as Joan Solomon once put it. While being involved in these dominant ways of engaging with science, operate from what Jim McGugan has called a form of moral regulation, a way of doing the right thing. So these ideas then build on a platform in which choosing to not participate or not being able to participate is almost unthinkable and can only be understood from this framework as a mistake. So these mistakes give little or no room to understand, to acknowledge, or to begin to ameliorate the damage done to particular people and communities by the structural inequalities that shape how people engage with and relate to science. So we have to make space for people to be able to reject science should they feel they need or want to, or to ignore it, or to feel that on the back of discriminatory socio-political histories rooted in structural inequalities that continue into contemporary practice, again, as we've seen with data in the UK, for instance, on COVID morbidity and mortality, how these illustrate deep social divides in the treatment and care for people from racialized backgrounds, poorer backgrounds, women and disabled people. And that people might choose justifiably to step away from science and science-related opportunities until these practices are transformed to become meaningfully inclusive and respectful. So to come back to this question of why inclusion is important, without working to challenge and transform these systems of science, as well as the spaces where people encounter science, like education, politics, cultural practices, and so on, any real meaningfully inclusive change will be limited. So what happens, for instance, to young people in a really well-designed inclusion project who in a museum who go on to study science at university and have a really hard time, as we know from so much research about, say, physics PhD students. So it's important that we open up opportunities to engage with and contribute to science, because science plays those important roles in our societies. And without having the choice to take part in science in ways that are respectful, equitable, and meaningful, we will not see those systems change. And we have to be really careful when we do this work that we understand what it is we are addressing. I am done. Should I need to pass back?
Thank you very much for this fascinating framing. So maybe now you could tell us a bit more on this issue based on your empirical fieldworks, and maybe afterwards you could we could have a look at your respective proposal in order to have inclusion concrete and real. So Clémence, would you like to follow up?
Yes, I'll be very happy to talk about the field work in a minute, but I just wanted to build up on what Emily has just said, because and say a bit more about the stakes here and why it's so important that we try to make science as diverse as possible, because it's been a few years now and I've been talking about this with many different people, and I realized little by little that there are actually several ways of framing the issue of diversity in science. And it's useful to know that not everyone calling for a wider access to science has the same intention. Because when you know it, and when you know the different ways of framing it, you can avoid a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of disappointment. Because you can make sure at the beginning that everyone is on the same page as to why we want more women, or more people from the working classes, or more minorities in science. Why is it that we are doing it? And there usually are three ways of responding. The first one is by having a almost purely economical perspective. Because on a large scale, science is the object of competition between countries or group of countries, and science is associated with economical and political issues. So in this context, strengthening scientific participation, especially in the younger generation, is a way to make the countries more competitive in the global knowledge economy. So to sum it up, here, it is, we need girls in science because we need all hands on deck if we are going to win this game. And that's one way of putting it, and you can hear at my tone that it may not be the way I advocate or I think is the most relevant. The second way of framing this is more or less the way Emily stressed when she explained what she just did. It is a matter of social justice, and that is very important because there is a social justice issue at stake here. It's basically very unfair in democratic societies that establish equality as a primary principle for a whole section of the population to be discriminated against in its access to a resource as valuable as science. So there is this, I think, fair social justice issue. But there is also a third way of explaining this or seeing the problem, and that is a scientific or epistemological way. Because since the 1970s, historians and sociologists, and at the beginning it was feminist scholars who did this, they vastly documented the way the lack of diversity in science has dire consequences for knowledge development, but also for their applications. So the relative absence of women, of the working classes, of minorities in science results in the production of incomplete and inaccurate knowledge, and in science applications that are actually quite dangerous to some people. Indeed, we have a truncated knowledge that is very unfavorable to the social groups excluded from science. In short, without diversity in the laboratories, we produce bad science, or at least science that is quite dangerous for some people, both in its content and its effect. We are talking about it a bit more nowadays because we have many examples from it's AI in English, artificial intelligence, So we talk about the dire consequences of the lack of diversities in IA, but there are also previous inequalities documented in medicine. For instance, we know that the fact that women, and especially Black women, are not or not enough included in the medical test, and especially the making of medical procedures is very bad for them, because the way they feel and they express pain is not taken into account. So they are not treated as well as they should be when they fall sick. So there is also this very practical stake. I think if we take both the social justice one and the stake I just said, we cover a lot of ground, because if people just don't care about social justice, maybe they will care about this other issue. Although I think if you care about one, you care about the other, and they really go hand in hand. So once we know all of this, it's time to go into field work and to wonder how exclusion actually operates. We'll talk about childhood, because I think both Emily and I studied what's going on during the childhood exposure to science. So we'll start with that. And I will start with saying that obviously when we want to understand how exclusion operates, we need to consider several exclusion mechanisms, several ways in which women, the working classes, or minorities are kept at a distance. And the first one is actually history. I think it's important to remind that. I think it's important to remember that it's only been a few decades that we actually think it would be a good idea for all these people to actually participate in science. For centuries, we, and when I say we, I mean white men, did everything they could to prevent that from happening. So it's no wonder that today we have such inequalities. It was made that way. It was actually made to be that way. So in France, for instance, until the 70s, the end of the 20th century, girls, boys, and kids from the countryside or from the cities were not taught the same science curriculum. It was done on purpose. Nobody wanted them to learn the same science and to do the same jobs afterwards. So this idea of having equal access to science is actually very new. So we need to remember that, because we need to remember that we are fighting against centuries of history and systems that were created, made, and maintained to be very exclusive, and to avoid all these peoples getting into them and actually getting to science. Another very important factor of exclusion is the way our school systems work and tend to lead students on a scientific pathway or not. Some students, depending on their gender and their social backgrounds, are actually actively deterred from entering these fields. I will not get into this today, because I think we know quite a lot about what's going on in schools, and it's interesting to talk about what's going on outside of school. And that's what I'll do by focusing on what I call in my work the scientific culture, and that is all science opportunities you can encounter in your everyday life, in school, but also outside of school. That is science contents from books, from TV or radio shows, from documentaries, games, museums, club and activities. So all these ways of engaging with science, they actually convey social images, representation of what science is and of who scientists are. And depending on who we are or who we think we are, we can or we cannot relate to this image and the scientists that are presented to us. That is a very important result from the field work I did. The research I developed in the book Jeanne presented is based on a 4 years long field investigation with children that came from working class and ethno-racialized family. That means that most of them had an immigrant background. So I was with those kids and I observed them when they took part in science workshops approximately once a week for 4 years. I also observed and talked to their teachers and some science mediators. And I also interviewed 50 of the kids individually twice. Once they were 10 to 11 years old, and I saw them again 2 years later. So I did all that with the children, and I also spent quite some time compiling international surveys about scientific cultural contents. That's when I actually met Emily's work. So I compiled the international surveys and I did my own. I wanted to see what is in scientific cultures, what images of science and scientifics we are given. And there are two key findings. The first one is that scientific culture spreads a very homogeneous representation of science as being a masculine and elitist field. You can look in books, on screens, in museums. Everywhere you look, you'll find scientific narratives where 75% of people are men and 90% of them are white. And yes, we counted. We actually did count the people in science booklets, in museums, etc. And in those contents, women and minorities are also either negated or depicted in extremely stereotypical ways. For instance, women are depicted as male objects or only there for their bodies, or sometimes they are also depicted as the stupid person you have to explain the science to. That's the first finding. The second finding is that all this has a huge effect on people, and even more so on children. Because what happens is that the more children seek science and the more they consume cultural scientific contents, the more they integrate the idea that science is everything that they are not when they are girls and when they are kids from minorities or from the working classes. So there is a true lack of identification figures that makes it extremely difficult to imagine oneself as a scientist, even as an amateur. So that was the two key findings from my field work, and I know that there are many more in Emily's studies.
Thank you, Clémence.
Okay, so I have got both books and I will just wave them at you all briefly out of my smugness. That's Clémence and that's mine. As you all know, we have similar-ish projects. So I will briefly describe what I found in the study this book is about. And I should say that we have done lots of other studies with kids in schools and teachers and families and museums. And in one of them, the one we are writing a paper on at the moment, Clémence, we have that almost exact framework of, there are a few different ways people talk about inclusion, and they're not all allied to community needs and assets or social justice. They can be allied to very different political rhetorics. So this study that the book is based on was actually with adults and sometimes their families in community groups in the neighborhood I lived in Southeast London. And what I used that data to make several arguments, which I will rehearse with you today. So first of all, as you can expect, exclusion from science, whether in school, in a museum, in popular culture, as a career or as a hobby, is a really complex issue. The study the book is based on found that exclusion was embedded in practice, and not just one or two practices, but it was embedded in every science-related practice that we encountered with these communities. So that is one quite astonishing thing if you think about how we understand engagement with science. Perhaps the next thing to say is this exclusion was absolutely expected by all the people who worked with me. And their expectations of exclusion were then borne out time and time again in all the experiences we shared in the project. So the book is based on about 3 years of fieldwork and at the 1.64 community groups that went down to 5 who stayed with me for a longer time in the project. And it was about trying to understand why some people easily and happily take advantage of science engagement opportunities, like visits to museums or watching TV documentaries, and others just didn't. So there's a huge amount of research already out there about the kinds of people who do science engagement activities. But at the time, there wasn't much research carried out with people who you couldn't already find in a zoo with their family at the weekends or at a science festival. So I organized the project with 5 grassroots community groups in my local neighborhood, all of whom were loosely organized around a shared sense of ethnic background. So they included a Somali group, a Sierra Leonean group, a Latin American group, an Asian group, and an Afro-Caribbean group. And of course, there's some movement within those groups. And we worked together doing field work for about 2 years, where I would go to their community events and we would talk about their experiences of science, whether that was at school, at work, at home, in politics, in the media, or in spaces like museums. And we also talked about their experiences of engaging in these different communication or education platforms. And group by group, they chose a science engagement thing to visit or do in London. And we went together. And of course, we spent a lot of time talking about that afterwards. And what we were able to show through that project, I think, is really helpful. So first of all, we were able to show what exclusion was not. So it was not because the people working with me weren't interested in science. And it was not because those people weren't interested in the kinds of spaces or media where science engagement happens. And it was not because they were not politically active. And it was not because they were not culturally active. Now that might seem really obvious, but as both Clemencé and I talked about earlier, if you look at the research literature, policy reports, and what happens in practice, these underlying assumptions still drive much of the activity around how we think about science engagement opportunities and inclusion and exclusion. The second thing that I really appreciated from that project was we were able to give a more nuanced and more detailed account of what those experiences of exclusion were like. Those experiences that were grounded then in these complex socio-political histories of structural inequality and their contemporary intersections, and in particular, although not limited to, this project, racism, sexism, class discrimination, and age. So as Idil from the Somali group put it, these science-related opportunities were not designed for us, whether that was at school, as a career, or wherever they encountered it. So this exclusion by design operated then as a kind of overwhelming cloud. It was ever present and indefatigable. So for instance, if we take one of the museum visits and we pull it apart, and you imagine then these visits were very similar across all the groups, wherever they went, whoever was in the group. The infrastructure of the visit to, say, a science museum was exclusive. First, finding the time to go on that kind of visit around back-to-back work shifts, childcare, and life was extremely difficult, with most people working while the museum was open and as a result unable to go in their day-to-day lives. Secondly, the museums were all in neighborhoods that the people working with me did not feel comfortable in. These neighborhoods were too posh, too expensive. No one in the neighborhood looked like them, let alone the people in the museum. It was too far away from their homes, and it was expensive and took a lot of time to travel there. And third, the buildings and their architecture were really off-putting. They were big, they were very fancy seeming, and they seemed really scary. Tickets were expensive, even when these places were actually free to enter, as many UK museums are, but there would be special exhibitions or big donation boxes that looked like expensive tickets. So actually getting into a science museum, science centre, or similar kind of activity was really hard just in the first place for the people who worked with me. And then once inside, very sadly, things got worse. And again, in multiple and overlapping ways. So people felt excluded, uncomfortable, and out of place in so many ways. Perhaps most immediately horrifying for the visits was that racial profiling was clearly common practice. Door staff who searched the bags of people working with me always left mine alone and would leave other white visitors' bags alone. And the same things happened in cafes and exhibitions, where the people in the project were always asked to leave before other people, or closely followed by attendants, and repeatedly told not to touch things, or told to make sure to get their children not to touch things, even when they really weren't touching anything. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. The museum and science centre's layouts were really confusing, with English as the only language for all signs, maps, and leaflets, to the point that people in the project were really disoriented and in some cases quite upset about feeling lost. And I'm sure, as you all know, as well as me, monolingual English practices are a huge piece of power work that happens. And although these participants were all really good at speaking and reading English and took part in a research project, these language practices symbolically and literally made them feel excluded in these spaces. The English language problem also happened when they were in exhibition spaces with particular exhibits. Their confusion was really made worse because a lot of assumptions were made on the part of these institutions about who visitors were, and these assumptions were built into exhibition design. So exhibition design would assume a certain amount of English language fluency, and we would have audio, written, and signed objects in English at the same time, for instance, to use a particular exhibit. There were assumptions made about how literate people were about using exhibits or museum spaces, as well as assumptions about their background scientific literacy, but also the background geographic or international and historic knowledge that they would bring to an exhibit. Maybe very predictably, the stories of rich dead white men took precedence over all others, and ultimately all stories were told through this lens, even if the story was about human ancestors and took place in the Afar region of Ethiopia in North Africa. It was always still framed, in this case, as a fossil discovery contest between two rich white men. And in addition, representation was hugely problematic. And by that, I mean coded in ways that were racist, sexist, classed, and more. So for instance, on top of the exclusive signals sent by having English as the only available languages in these spaces, the kinds of images used and stories told were Eurocentric, typically offensive, patronizing, or outright racist about the knowledges, practices, and peoples of other countries and places. And as the people involved in the project all noticed, all the other staff and visitors were white with posh accents and seemed to have a lot of money to spend in the expensive shop and the expensive cafe. While this set of overlapping museum and science centre and science activity design practices meant traditional object-based exhibits, so exhibits with historic objects in them, or hands-on exhibits that you might see at a festival or at a science centre, and the interactive exhibits that are common to science centres, these were pretty much inaccessible for the people involved in the project, even once they were physically inside the building, which was itself hard enough to do. And on top of that, the content the museum staff practices, and the overall experiences, of which obviously we have much more data, these were offensive, off-putting, and extremely emotionally draining for the people involved in the project. So what this means for me then, to wrap up how this field work kind of illustrates issues around inclusion and exclusion as far as it comes to science, is that it is not enough to try and change patterns of inclusion and exclusion by just shoehorning excluded groups, communities, and people into these unchanged science engagement practices. This kind of inclusion is not, as the project shows, inclusive. It is ultimately harmful, disrespectful, and can only make things much, much worse.
Thank you, Emily. Well, Clemence, would you like to tell a bit more about your field work and or talk about your proposals, because that's a very important part, a very interesting part of both of your books, that not only you provide us a very rich analysis, but you also have some proposals and that helps reducing the anxiety of such an issue, because it seems so huge that it's difficult to see how could we reduce the exclusion. So maybe you could talk about this right now.
Yes, thank you, Jeanne. I'll talk about this because I think both Emily's and my research really show dire exclusion at work in the science opportunities, museums, schools, and I don't know about Emily, but I got out of it quite depressed, because having seen all this exclusion at work, it was, well, nothing is going well and this doesn't work at all, and we'll never make it all right. But after taking time far away from the field, I think it's needed to be able to think about solutions and to think about what we see is going wrong, we can maybe transform and translate, to think about what we could do to make it better. So in hopes of ending on a positive note, I'll talk about what we can try to do to make it better. I think that first of all, we really need to understand the problem and to accept that there is indeed exclusion at work. Because I've seen so many projects meaning so well, really meaning to do something. But when you asked the people involved, many of them were not convinced that the problem was that big, or that it wasn't due to some kind of nature in us. So it's interesting to ask people involved in that kind of project, why are you here and what do you think the problem is actually? Because many of them will say, well, I've heard it, I'm not actually sure that there is that much of a problem with women in science, and if women just don't like science, maybe it is just how they are and maybe they should be left alone. And as Emily said, it's important to allow people to dislike science. It's important to allow people to not be interested in science, but it should not be linked with any of their characteristics. It should not be, it shouldn't come from their gender or their background or their skin colors. It should really be separated from all of that. So we need to really understand what's going on. The title of my book is really, I think it cannot be translated. I think it would be lost in translation. But it's basically it says that in France we've got something called the math hump or the math bug. And what I'm saying, it doesn't exist. It's a way of saying there isn't any natural explanation for our interests or abilities in science. There's nothing natural about it. And I think it's really important to say it and say it again and stress it, because even when we know about it in theory, we can sometimes fall back on it when we are stressed or when we are confronted with some things we don't like. It happens to me all the time. I tried to do math the other day and I ended up just exclaiming, "Oh my God, you are so stupid." And then I had to catch myself back, saying, no, you just have to work on it a little more. It will come to you if you just put some effort. You are not innately incapable of doing this. But after almost a decade of working on this, I still have to remind myself periodically that this has nothing to do with nature. So we have to remind ourselves of that again and again and again in order for it to have a chance to work. So once we have this good foundation, we obviously need to do something about science representations. Emily describes how it goes in museums, and it's actually what she describes I also saw, our teams also saw in the French museums. It's exactly the same. So there is obviously need to work on that and to work on science representations in books, in audiovisual productions, to ensure that all Emily said is taken into account, and that, for instance, all genders, all skin colors, all lifestyles are included, and that there is no remnant of sexist, racist, or classist discriminations in all those contents. You would be surprised how much there actually are, how much of racist, blatantly racist things there are in science contents, for instance. And finally, and this is a very unpopular take, especially in France, inclusion has to be put into practice, and it even has to be imposed, especially in institutions, in schools, and in university. That is, we need to force ourselves to do it, to show that it can be done, and to have the spark that will later on make it possible for it to be done on its own. That is, we have to impose the presence of women, of people from the working classes, of minorities in classes, in universities. We need quotas, or we need voluntary recruitment, because that is what actually works. That is something that we often don't want to do, but that is what actually works. There are already good examples of that in IT universities in the United States, where they chose to recruit female professors, then they chose to recruit female students, and at the same time they changed all the curriculum to make sure that it was inclusive, and they changed a lot of their policies as well, and it actually worked. It's been 20 years and they still have diversity in their schools. So forcing ourselves to do it is we don't really want to admit that we have to, but I think it's one of the ways we can actually make things better. And the final step I will mention, the final way we can act, probably the most difficult one, is to question scientific knowledge itself, and to really ponder how the lack of diversity can produce bad science, and has been producing a science that is not as rational, as neutral, or as universal as we tend to think it is. So that's quite complicated for us, because we live in a world where science is this objective, neutral, and rational entity that will save us all. And we have to question that, and to think that maybe it isn't, and maybe it is something that has been created, and that feeds Eurocentric and very male-dominated dynamic that is extremely problematic. So I think that would be the last step, questioning science itself, and really rethinking the way we actually produce knowledge and produce science.
Thank you very much, Clémence. So let's see what Emily has to say about inclusion in practice.
So many things, but I will try and keep a lid on it. So I suppose my overarching message, as with Clemencé again, is of course these projects can be quite depressing. And so the conclusion I have reached is similar to hers, and it is that we have to radically reimagine everything about these practices, from whose stories are told and how they are told, to who is represented and how they are represented, to who has power in these spaces and how that power is used. What I see in my research and with talking to people is that even small experimental attempts at inclusion can afford really important opportunities to build relationships, to learn and to reflect, and that this can happen in ways that help us to embrace the challenges posed by structural inequalities and working towards equity-oriented change. And change, of course, can happen in so many different ways. But here is my cynicism, and then I will be more constructive afterwards. There is always a question for me about whether reform of existing practices is possible. And I'm thinking here about some work we've been doing in more recent projects where we have long-term practice research partnerships set up between researchers at the university that I work at and then practitioners across 8 different science engagement, public science organizations, and then with young people as co-researchers. And they're young people from, in this country, disadvantaged backgrounds. And we pay them to be co-researchers. And we have this long project where we have developed a lot of tools to think about how we can work together, what it means to put youth and community at the center of practice. And we have a website, it's www.yesstem.org, which is full of the tools that have come out of this project. And that project is very much focused on the idea that you can reform what already exists. And the realist in me says, we have to reform what already exists because these things will not disappear overnight. I don't think in this country the government would turn around tomorrow and stop funding the large-scale public science institutions, or that the mass media would suddenly drop these related practices. This isn't going to happen, so we do have to change them. But it's a big question for me about how that works, because we are so embedded in these structural inequalities. So what I am interested in and have been working a lot on in the last couple of months is how we can usefully reimagine what counts as what Clemencé calls culture scientifique, or the sciences culture, in ways that de-center these institutions, that de-center dominant narratives, and maybe look at those everyday practices from everybody. Because science and society relationships are partially governed by these dominant practices and these dominant institutions. But everybody has a relationship within that sphere of science and society. Whether that relationship is good or bad, whether it's one of agency or maybe one of feeling more passive, or one where you feel like you are constantly represented, or one where you feel that you are never represented, that relationship is still there. And as this book that we've been talking about that I wrote today, there's a lot of information in there about how the communities who worked with me do still relate to science, but in very different ways and outside of these dominant paradigms. So one question I have for thinking seriously about inclusive science relationships is, if we were to start to understand more and take seriously and value these other spaces and these other modalities of relating to science, what would that show us? And I don't mean that in a romantic way. I think that doing that empirical work would show us as many dystopic real opportunities as utopic real opportunities. We would see, for every piece of emancipatory fan fiction around science fiction, we would see a gamer mod around rape practices in, say, the game The Witcher. But I think if we can have a better understanding of that non-dominant landscape, we can start to make space for understanding more kinds of relationships with science that go outside of these dominant practices. I should also say, I do usually talk about different science and social justice frameworks, and you can find all of them on the STEM website. But today I'm derailing a little bit into this. What if we re-understand that landscape? What opportunities does that give us for inclusive science communication? And I'll put our website in the chat so that you can see it if that's useful.
Thank you very much to both of you. I think this is a good time to attend comments and questions. For now, we have 2 comments. I'm going to read them, to voice them, so that they can be translated to Spanish. The first one is from Luz Valgues, who was our guest in a former roundtable last year. And she says, I agree. I think trying to include Black and other minoritized women in a white, male-dominated institution as science is violent. I mean, without radically changing the institution as such. And they also forwarded me, Francisca forwarded me a comment from Facebook from Rocio, who says, totally agree. We need to change and restate our own misconceptions about whom and who we do science. Regarding the US models of inclusion, as stated before, it is not just a matter of increasing the numbers of underrepresented minorities in science, but putting a system in support and change in place. So the 2 comments are quite similar in their purpose. I don't know if you'd like to react on these comments. For now, there are no questions. So maybe Clémence.
Thank you. Just to thank the person who participated for their comments, because it's absolutely, I think they really captured what we meant to say. I really agree with what is pointed out here, and I also would like to take the opportunity to say that as researchers, as scientists, although we are not scientists in the STEM field as it is usually defined, we are social scientists, but we still take part on the professional field, the wide professional science field. I think we are really part of this. I will talk for Jeanne and Emily. You can contradict me later if you want, but I think you feel that too, that it's really hard to take part in this male-dominated institution, and I want to resist the way science is done nowadays, with all the competition and the fact that we have to prove ourselves all the time, and that you have to go faster and further and do more things all the time. I think it's a really bad way to do science, and that we would be better off completely changing this. And a lot of the voices calling for change actually come from the people who are dominated in the field, and who are calling for a more ethical way to do science that is both more ethical and more inclusive, because it would take into account, well, the reality of our lives as people who have families, who have hobbies, who have bodies even. So I would also take this moment to thank you all for doing this, because we had a very hard years, and it's been quite difficult for everyone, and we all know that these years have been harder on women and on people who are in precarious positions in the scientific field. So I wanted to say, well done, ladies. Thank you so much. I think we can say that I'm really glad that I have colleagues like you, because we managed to make small efforts towards a more collaborative science, when we can talk together and really answer one another. And I think that's something we try to put out there, and that's part of the process.
Thank you. I don't know if whether Emily would like to react on the comments. I also have a question from Francisca. So I'm gonna translate the question, and then you see in which order you'd like to react, Emily, and then later Clemence, if you like to. Francisca is wondering whether, considering both of you are embedded in this issue and those issues for a decade or so, have you seen some changes, hopefully for better, but in the last few years?
Shall I go? Clemence, is that okay?
Yes, please.
Francisca, thank you for your question. I'm going to be so cynical and say no. I have seen changes, but they aren't always the changes I would want. So in the recession, so I've been, excuse me, I've been working in this field for 20 years now. The two big changes for me that stood out have been the recession of sort of the late 2000s, where in this country we saw the larger institutions who had started to have staff jobs like community officer, outreach officer, inclusion officer. These jobs all disappeared in waves of redundancies during that recession. And the last year, in a fit of adrenaline, seeing the same thing happen with the pandemic, I wrote something with Barbara Streicher, who runs the Austrian Science Center Network, for the Excite magazine, to try and make the case that we were already seeing those same waves of redundancies. I already saw my colleagues and friends working in those community liaison, in-reach, outreach, inclusion roles being made redundant, and to call for using the pandemic as a broader way to think about inclusive change rather than a doubling down on kind of only those bits of practice that felt most secure. For instance, in this country, alongside those redundancies, we saw a lot more ticketing. Obviously, a lot of institutions lost a lot of money. And one response to that was to prioritize high fee paying individuals and visitors, increasing prices in shops and cafes. And while in one way that is understandable as a response to long-term closures and obvious huge economic impact, on the other hand, for all the kinds of concerns we've been talking about today, those policies and practices are hugely problematic and will set, in my opinion, the inclusion agenda back by 10 years again, as we saw with the last big recession. I should temper that with some more positive thoughts about, yes, when I started doing this work, nobody even talked about this. And when I talked about it, it was really weird for people. And the whole thing was, it felt like I was saying things that were very extreme and that were sort of highly unusual. And I have definitely seen in the last 10 years, at least the languages and some of the concepts around inclusion and inclusive practice start to become more mainstream. So my hope, of course, is that mainstreaming is not just a fashion, and that we can make it sustainable and, perhaps more importantly, meaningful and respectful and transformative, rather than small one-off projects. Because I do think small projects have a lot of value, but they have value where they are a lever to bigger change, to wider change, rather than what we sometimes see, and I don't know if everyone else sees this, but smaller inclusion projects that then stop and don't actually get the next round of funding, have permanent staff posts, or create transformative changes in community relationships. So I guess I'm still calling for that bigger transformation of the field, really. I appreciate that was a bit of a depressing answer.
Thank you, Emily. Clemence, what would you like to say about this?
Yeah, I would pretty much say the same. I don't have anything more optimistic to say, sadly. I've noticed the same trend as Emily. The issue is becoming mainstream. Well, a little part of the issue is becoming mainstream. That is the gender issue. The rest of it, at least in a European context, is still pretty much swept away. So actually now we all agree that there is an issue with women in science. So that is actually that's all right. It can be said. It's still quite hard to say, yeah, women are not the only one who are excluded. People from the working classes and people from minorities are also excluded. I see it a lot while promoting this book. The book is not about gender, the book is about science and exclusion, but I'm always asked to talk about women in science, which I do, but I always regret that it's always the same issue that is put forward. So this subject is becoming mainstream with good and bad results. We see more and more projects about putting women in science in history forward. That is, for instance, reminding us that there were important women in science back in the 19th century, which is extremely important. But at the same time, now it's always the same women being discussed and being put forward. So we are recreating something that we know is not good for the other excluded groups, that is the image of heroes and exceptional people. So we only had Marie Curie, no, we had a few more. We have Rosalind Franklin, or we have Katherine Johnson. They made the Hidden Figures movie about her. And this movie, I think, is an extremely good example on what is really good about it and what is really bad about it at the same time. This movie has been very, very important. If you don't know about it, it's a movie about the Black women that were mathematicians and engineers at the NASA, and they played a huge part in NASA activities. So it was extremely important to point that they existed, that they did a lot of the work, and that they were a major force at NASA. So the film that was extremely good for that. But at the same time, it shows always the same narrative. At the beginning of the story, you have a little girl. She's to grow up and be a Katherine Johnson, who is the main researcher and the heroine of the film. And she is a genius. She's 5 and she's already incredibly competent. You have this classical scene, there's a blackboard and she's scribbling things on the blackboard, and there's a music, and all the adults are looking at her with huge eyes saying, wow, what's going on? And this is again and again and again the same story about genius kids growing up to be genius scientists. And this is really, really, it's a myth. This doesn't happen in the real world. Nobody is born a genius scientist. People learn how to become good scientists. So I think this is a really good example to show what is going well and what is still missing from all these narratives about women in science from Hidden Figures.
Thank you very much to both of you. It seems we don't have further questions. Yeah, I really want to warmly thank you, and the incredible work of our two interpreters too, Maria Elena and Jasmine. And yeah, I think your respective researches open really important paths to think about exclusion, gender, intersectionality, and access to science. I'm a big fan of yours, and I'm really, really happy we had the opportunity to share this space today. So thank you very, very much.